Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time what we're going to be taking a look at is we're going to be looking at different ways of organizing our project. So when we're talking about organizing our project, there's quite a few different sort of aspects to it. There's how we actually organize the individual files for the project. There is looking at how can we structure the code to make things easier to find and easier to work with. And so we're going to be taking a look at a range of things. So firstly, looking at some stuff with the project structure side, and then looking at a few solutions that we have from the technical side that can help us with both organizing things and also the performance side. Now, why we care about this is when we've got a very small project. So I would say something under, kind of 50 to 100 files, under that sort of size. It's pretty easy to find stuff. The amount of time for searching for things is pretty low. But as our projects increase in size, if we don't have things well organized, it gets slower and slower to find stuff. And in particular, then when you get on to medium, large size project ones, where you might have thousands or even tens of thousands in some cases of files between code and various assets that we have, that time for finding things is quite significant. So we want to try and make that as quick as possible. The other thing is having our project well organized, in particular some of the things we'll look at from a code point of view, actually make it easier to reuse code. They also make it faster for our development process. So that's what's really important for looking at ways that we can do this organization. It's something that can really benefit the project, and it's something where it's good to get it up and running in that approach from early on. Okay, so to begin with, let's look at about organizing our folders and files. Now, there isn't one universal right way to go about doing this. There are many ways that we can go about structuring it, but I'm going to talk through how sort of organize things these days in projects and the reasons for why I use that approach. So generally, I will have for a project, I'll create a folder structure that is going to look sort of something like of this. So I'm going to have a common folder. So common folder, the intent there is there should be nothing in that is super project specific. It's something where everything in that folder, whether that's assets, code, any of the things in there, the intent is that I could take that and drop that into another project and use it in there. So having a bit of a split between this is common stuff that I want to reuse in other projects, and also having a case of here are things that are game specific. So I'll have common. I will usually have a folder that is for the particular game, and I'll usually call that, whatever the name of the thing is, and then game. So in this case, I would just potentially call this tutorial game, but I would change tutorial to whichever, whatever the name was for the particular game. And if it's not named at that point, then use either just a generic game or sort of a more code name one for it. And then I'll usually have a third-party folder. So it's quite common that there might be additional plugins, assets, things like that we use. Things that aren't common ones that we're reusing in every project, things that aren't a part of the game that we have built. So they're things that have come from third parties. So I usually put them into that third-party folder. Now, you can't always move everything into that folder. You do get some cases where some assets won't handle being in a different folder than the one they are required to be in, or the one they default to. That's not super common, but it does happen. So when you're doing this organization, do make sure you're checking in regularly before you move particular stuff. I wouldn't go and do a mass reorganization all in one commit necessarily. Do it sort of progressively and test how the process goes. So, okay, we've got our different setups there. Now, there might be some additional folders that need to be created because of your specific needs. So you might have stuff like a streaming assets one or resources. That's completely fine. but this general broad structure of our common, our third party, and our actual game specific one. So then we can start to organize things. So these scenes I would put under here because the scenes are specific to this project. So I'm going to call this demo scene. So I'd have my scenes set up like of that. I would usually then have folders for different assets. So I would actually group those. I would actually have a separate content folder. And I would also have a scripts folder. Then, okay, so content, we've got lots of different types of content. So generally, I would group it by the particular type. So I would have things like a textures folder. Now, if I had a lot of textures, I might split that into here are textures for user interface and sprites, and then here are ones for use by materials. So you could do a split like of that. So I would then also usually have a folder. So I usually would put materials separate from the textures. I'd have separate folders for shaders. Content, depending upon how you're working with audio, if you're using the built-in audio system, I'd have an audio folder. If you are using an external system like Fmod or Wwise, then that's going to be data that sits sort of outside of the project, so you wouldn't have a folder for it. We also might have scriptable objects. So I would have something like a data folder where we put the scriptable objects. We might have meshes. So keeping that sort of general structure there. So content is all of the potential sort of assets, data, materials, textures, everything like of that. But very specifically, no code with the exception of shaders. So shaders I usually put in with the content because they very specifically tie into stuff like that. The case where I might make an exception there is if I was doing something like a compute shader for working out particular calculations, things like of that. Then I would probably put that into the scripts folder. So that's good. We might also have a configuration folder. So this would be where different plugins, things like of that, might have configuration data. If you're using the high definition or universal pipeline, those have configuration assets. So I'd put them into that folder. If you're using the new input system, you'll have configuration there. I would put that into there as well. So it keeps anything that's configuration related in that same location. For scripts, I would then divide this up based upon their area, their system, their functionality, things like of that. So I would have just different systems that I define here. And this structure that I have here, I would use that same structure in the common folder. The difference there is that we probably wouldn't have configuration, but the rest of our ones, like we likely would have scenes and scripts and content. So I would actually have that same structure here. Now we wouldn't in third party. So the idea behind this is we have a very clear, very specific structure that we use for our common content, our common content and assets. We have that same structure that we use for the configuration for and everything for our particular game. And then third party assets. That folder is essentially no rules apply. That folder is where we put all of the third-party assets that we can, and they maintain the structure that they originally defaulted to. I actually specifically wouldn't restructure the third-party assets because that makes it more difficult from a merging point of view later if you're upgrading it, things like of that. So third-party, you just have that be organized however it was. But our common folders and our tutorial or our actual main game folder, we have that following our very strict rigid structure, so it's clear and easy to find stuff. Now, if you find you have a lot of things, like a lot of meshes, a lot of textures, then we'd set up further subfolders. We'd organize that on an even finer level. That's entirely appropriate there for that. So that's the broad structure I use for organizing a project, and that's a structure I find works quite well. Similar structure that Epic tends to recommend for their games. It's a really solid, reliable structure. It's what we're actually using these days for Heave. So it works quite well. And because Heave is a good example where we do have several hundred files, I would say now. Source code alone is probably, if not at, or it'd be very near to or over actually 100 code files at this point, and a lot of data. We have a lot of data assets, a lot of visual assets. So this has made it a lot easier to actually find everything for it. So, okay, that's a general folder organization style of thing that I would recommend. Let's look at the code side then. So let's look at setting up a script. So I'm going to put this one in the common folder. And what I'm going to do is, this script might be something that it's just, in this case, it's going to be pretty arbitrary, but it's going to be pretty arbitrary for a very specific reason. So the idea is I'm going to make a script that it's just going to present a bit of an interface for changing the size and the color of a particular bit of text. So I'm going to call this a TMPro helper, because this is going to be something that is within TextMesh Pro. So again, if we had a lot of scripts here, we'd set up subfolders for them. So once I've got this loaded up, we're going to take a look at this. And so what it's going to do, so I'm going to just bring in TextMesh Pro. Isn't going to pair off of mono behavior. And I'm just going to have a public static void set text font and set text size and color. So we provide this with a TMP text to update, give it a size and a color. And then all it's going to do is text to update, and then the size is equal to that, and text to update. And we have a few different colors, but that's all it's going to do. So just want something super, super simple. So, okay, this code, if I was going to use this in something, so I'm just going to add in a little bit of text, import the TextMesh Pro Essentials. Okay, we've added in the TextMesh Pro setup there. And then I'm just going to add in a little script. And this is going to just be something where, okay, I'm going to update UI text. These are very arbitrary files, just to demonstrate using this. So we've got our text. We're going to position that so it is centered. And we'll make that fully centered like of that. So canvas, I'm going to just use the normal setup that I would do. So we scale with screen size. And I'm just going to clear this to a solid color, just so we can easily see the text. Good. So I'm going to put the script onto here. And again, this is a very, very, very arbitrary setup, entirely just to illustrate using the setup that we're going to be doing from a code point of view. So, okay. I want to do a get component, and I want to get the TMP text on the current game object. And then what I'm going to do is use the TMPro helper, set text size and color, giving it the text. I'm going to change the size to be larger and make the color green. So completely arbitrary one, just to purely test out the code, make sure the code runs and works. That's really the only purpose of it. So good, works. So as this goes on and as it builds up, we would get progressively more and more code in the common section, and we might end up with quite a lot. And we might end up with a lot of third-party assets that we're using, and that can make it tricky for finding and organizing things. If you think on a very large project, you have stuff where you might have an audio system, and that audio system needs to probably track the position of things. So it probably has something called position or a vector 3. We've got a physics system. It might also have a vector 3. Pathfinding for AI. Lots of different things might have ways of storing position, and they might use the same name for it, but internally it might look different because that's not uncommon. So we want to be able to have things separated to be able to distinguish them. So one of the things that we can do is we can use something called a namespace. So all of our common code, we could set up namespace common like this. And so for every file that we have, every bit of code in our common library, we put inside this namespace. We could also do the same for our game code. That's not an uncommon thing, probably less often seen than you would see for your common code library, but still something that can be done. I think the main thing is using something like this in that common code has a really big advantage. So, okay, we've put it in a namespace. What that means is then, okay, here I would have to do common dot. So if I had multiple things called TMPro helper, I can now tell the difference between them. So it groups and organizes the code. And we can also bring that in so we don't need to always be writing that every time. So we can say using common. So that's another approach that we've got for that. So that's good. That allows us to organize the code neater. It allows us to avoid potential conflicts between sections of the code, which is really beneficial. That can, I've had cases where the conflicts don't always cause errors. Quite often they don't cause errors, and then you can get some really, really subtle problems. I've had sections where in the code, two different sections of code had a definition for a particular keyword. And I can't remember the specific one, but it was a particular keyword. There was an enumeration, both had it, and they actually had different values for the same name of thing. So what that meant was, depending upon in the code which sections of code you had included, you could get different values for it. And that was actually caused some really hard to find bugs. So using namespaces, we can keep things a bit more separate, which is good. There's another thing we can actually do that doesn't only just enforce that separation a much stricter. Because at the moment, we could very easily put stuff in the common code that is referencing the game code. So we can make a change that makes it that we can't easily do that. And has the benefit that it improves compile time performance because it's not having to recompile as much stuff. So what we can do is I go to the top level of my common folder. I right click and I go to create. And I create this thing called an assembly definition. So C# and Unity's, we're working in C# a lot. Things get packaged into assemblies. If we don't do anything extra, pretty much every bit of code all gets packaged into the one assembly. So that means when we change a bit of code, it has to recompile everything. If we start putting stuff into assemblies, it then is only needing to recompile the code for that assembly. So it's a way of delineating out chunks of the code. So this actually can really improve our development time performance. And you'll see, it's also giving me an error. And that's because an assembly only has access to the things that we tell it has access to. So at the moment, I haven't told it that it should know that TextMeshPro exists. So by default, it doesn't think it does. So what I can do is I select my assembly definition, and then over here, I can come and set these references. So if I go to plus, then I can select here, and then all of the possible references that it's aware of will be listed here. So I can select TextMeshPro, and then I can do apply. And we'll see, it'll need to recompile, but those errors are then gone. Now you might find that there's a lot of assets that you need to add in there. That's not uncommon. So things like Cinemachine, pretty much any of those things that are a separate package. If you're working with them in the assembly, you will need to add them in here. So that's quite common. So things like the new input system, Cinemachine, timeline, all of those ones, if you're working with them, you'll need to actually reference them here. Now we can also define other things, so you can actually make it that an assembly is specific to a particular platform. There's a lot of really handy things that we can actually be doing here with these assembly definitions. We're using a very small portion of it, but this is something that we can absolutely be doing if we wanted to, is have that same code for different platforms in different assemblies. So, okay, we've put this into an assembly. And then what that means is if I tried, and it will need to reload because things are split off into different solutions. Down here, previously, I could have referenced update UI text. If I try to do that now, just do something like of that. Now, it's not complaining at this point. But if I go back to here, I actually get an error. And this is one of the big values with doing like of this, of setting up these assemblies, is that common code. I said that I wanted that, and in general, we want that to be something that can transport to other projects. And the danger is if we accidentally bring stuff into that, which is from the core game or is referencing the core game. By splitting it off into its own separate assembly, we can't. It forces us to design better interfaces for things and to structure our code better so that we don't need to do that. So that's really valuable, really advantageous. So if you're in this common folder setup, I would always recommend using an assembly definition. Now, in terms of our actual main game, if we got to the point where we're having large numbers of files in the main game, we might want to actually split this off into separate assemblies. Now that's going to be a little bit trickier potentially to do. We'd probably be doing that on a system level. So we don't want to go overboard and start putting every single system in its own separate assembly. That can get very messy very quickly. But there may be systems that you have where it's a case like, okay, no, actually all of this system, it does make sense for it to go in its own assembly, and I can absolutely do that. So I would only recommend doing that if it's on a larger project, compile time is starting to become a noticeable thing. But if it is, you could start to split subsystems off if those were large subsystems. So, for example, if I take something like of Heave, we have a system that manages the liquids. That's not a very large system though. It's one file for the manager and one for each type of liquid. So I wouldn't split that off. And in the case of Heave, apart from our common assembly, the rest of the game is all in the same central one, because while there is a lot of files, they're relatively small in many cases, and it's not something where it's worth sort of splitting it off. But if I take something like the procedural generation projects that we've looked at before, that has quite a few files, and it's also a very self-contained system. So the procedural generation, that actually could absolutely be moved into its own assembly, so it's nice and self-contained. So that would be what I would be looking for if I was wanting to, or needing to for performance, splitting off sections of the core code. I would look and see what are sections here that are very clearly sort of able to be grouped, but that then once they are grouped, that group kind of stands alone. It's fairly independent, doesn't have deep links to other sections of the code, and then move that into its own assembly. That's sort of how I would recommend approaching that. So don't go and start putting everything into assemblies. That's overkill, can get really messy and really tangled very quickly. So you shouldn't be setting up a lot of assemblies. If you find you're creating, dozens of assemblies, I'd say if you find you're creating even several assemblies, there might be architectural issues there that you want to try and look at reorganizing stuff and putting things into, more sort of groups of assemblies there. But this is an approach that allows us to, for our common code, keep that split off. Now, our TextMesh Pro here is sitting outside the third-party folder, but as I said, we can't always move everything. So we can test with this and we can see, okay, can we move? And you can see that it's run into an issue there with that. So we can cancel that. And, we can check, because it could be because we've got TextMesh Pro open, so I could create a brand new empty scene, and then I could try moving it and see if it successfully moves, but it may not. So you can see that it does have stuff where it will just absolutely refuse. Now you could try, okay, can I move individual folders? Will it let me move individual ones? You can see it moved bunch of stuff. See, it successfully moved the shaders. We can try, okay, documentation. So that moved okay. Can try moving the fonts. Also okay. And we can try moving third party. So we can see everything actually moved fine. So the problem, the thing locking it, isn't an individual file. It's likely the operating system has a folder open, something like that. So sometimes you might find that what you need to do, and we can see, okay, we're back into our demo scene. We don't see our text, and that likely is down to me having not saved, because it also didn't remember the background. But we can see we've got our text, and we can add back in a component. So we can add in scripts. So we've got our update UI text. So we can test that, make sure that still works, which it does. So sometimes when you're needing to move stuff, if the operating system has that folder open, you may not be able to move it at that point in time. So we can try and see, and so it has let us delete it, which is good. So now our folder structure at the top level is very neat. It's very easy to find stuff. So we know, okay, is it something that is specific to the game? Cool, it's in tutorial game. Is it something that is an asset we have gotten from elsewhere? Okay, that'll be under third party. Or if it's something that is shared code, it's under common. So it keeps everything more organized. That means that it's a lot easier to find stuff, it's a lot quicker to find stuff, and through using things like the assembly definitions, we're also able to make it that our development process is quicker from the point of view of if it has to compile code, it's compiling less of it, which is good. It allows us to speed up the development, which is always a good thing. So dive in and experiment with this. See, take an existing project of yours, or if you want to, grab any of the previous projects that I've set up. There are some quite large ones there, and look at, okay, if I needed to restructure it, how would that actually look? What would that restructured version look like? The one thing I would say is if you are restructuring an existing project, two incredibly important things. Firstly, make sure you have a backup, or it's committed to repository, some form of backup somewhere, whether that's repository, that's the ideal, or elsewhere, but you have a backup before you begin. That's rule number one. Don't start doing large-scale change that might damage things without that backup. Rule number two, if you are moving files, move them within Unity. If I move stuff within Unity here, it will go and update and keep track of things, because alongside each of these folders, and if I open this in Explorer, there's these meta files. So every file in our assets folder applies to scripts, everything like of that, has one of these meta files. A folder or a file and its corresponding meta file always need to be together. So moving them outside of Unity, it's very easy to make mistakes, very easy to get things wrong there. So move them always within Unity, because then it will handle moving the meta file and updating any references that need to be updated. Same thing for if you're renaming things. So that's the two big rules. Have a backup first, and do any relocation, renaming within Unity. That's going to make it that it's going to work a bit more reliably. It's a much safer way of working with it. But as I said, dive on in, see how you could apply this to your own projects, see how you could apply this to some of the demo projects that I've got there, and just experiment with it and get a feel for if this is a structure that you feel is going to work for you, or if there might be changes that's going to make it then a better structure that you're happier with. There's no one size fits all for structure. This is just one that I do recommend that I found works quite well as you get to larger projects. Thanks folks, hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe. It really helps out, it's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code for the project, the code is available up on GitHub, and there's a link to that in the description below. You can use the code in any of your own projects, commercial or non-commercial ones. If you've got any questions, chuck in a comment below. If you're trying to search for other videos, I do have a searchable video archive up as well, and that's a link to that in the description also, and that's an archive that you can search based upon the description, keywords, things like of that. So that's a way if you're trying to track down a particular topic. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description below as well. But until next time, bye!